Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Yes.
Fair.
Virtual audience. Hi, can you hear me? Or hi at the owl as well. My name is Christina Kempe. I'm the director of the Center for Canadian American Studies. I'd like to welcome you to our third part of our six-part speaker series. And I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. So the Center for Canadian American Studies, as you can see, we have our nice banner over here on the side, and the Western Washington University Alumni Association. We're very excited to welcome you here this afternoon to today's webinar called Locating Canadian Slavery, a Comparative and Transnational Approach. Today's featured speaker is Sarah Shute. Sarah is a PhD student studying slavery and freedom in 18th and 19th century North America at the University of Toronto. Her research interests are in the history of enslavement in Canada, the transnational free and forced migration, trade, and how slavery connected the maritime colonies to other parts of the Atlantic world, including British Caribbean. So here's the exciting part. Sarah was once in this exact class right here not too long ago. She graduated from Western in 2019 with a double specialization, I just used my French word, specialization, double major in French history and a minor in Canadian American Studies. And so then she went on to do a master's, and now she is doing a PhD in Canadian history at the University of Toronto. In this talk, Sarah will discuss how the history of slavery in Canada can only be understood in a comparative and transnational context. Specifically, the proximity to the United States and the wider Atlantic world that had shaped enslaved people's experiences and bondage in the maritime colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Their stories help us grasp the vast, violent, and insidious power of slavery in North America and give nuance to the opportunities they seized and obstacles they faced as a result of their enslavement in what would later become part of Canada. So we're very excited to have Sarah with us today, not only as a guest speaker in our Canadian history class here on campus, but also, as I mentioned, as our third speaker in the center's exciting new six-part speaker series called Why Canada Matters. This speaker series is brought to you by the generous support of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Department of History, and in partnership with Western Alumni Office. So just a little bit of housekeeping for our virtual audience before we begin. Some of you have submitted questions with your registration. Thank you very much for those. We always appreciate getting questions for our speakers. And same thing here in the class. We hope to have some questions from you all. So please use the Zoom Q&A feature for those who are joining us virtually. It should be at the bottom middle of your screen so that you can send us your questions. We will be responding to them at the end of the presentation, and I will first look to questions from our in-house audience first, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And we recommend for those who are joining us virtually to use the speaker view as part of Zoom. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. Sarah, welcome. It's so good to see you again. Sarah Shute.
Thank you very much. I want to first start off and give my thanks for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm really grateful to the Center for Canadian American Studies and Christina specifically for inviting me and just to be a part of this exciting series. Also for the Alumni Association for facilitating this event. I'm very excited that this talk is occurring during the History 277 Canada Historical Survey course. And I realized not only I knew I took this course, but I realized as I was preparing for our conversation that it was in that course that I first learned about the history of slavery in Canada. So it's sort of strikes me as a full circle kind of moment to be here with you today. So thank you very much. I'm going to be setting up my PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yes?
It's good, Sarah.
Okay. All right. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land from which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to live and work on this land. My talk today centers on a history that took place in Mi'kma'ki, Wolastoqiyik, and Pescatawagatik, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Pescatawagati. Today, we're going to be thinking about locating Canadian slavery. This topic forces us to ask a few questions. What is Canadian slavery? Where did it take place? Why does it matter? I hope to show how this history can only be understood in a comparative and transnational context. The stories of enslaved people in the maritime colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island help us grasp the vast, violent, and insidious power of slavery in North America. Their stories give nuance to the opportunities they seized and the obstacles they faced as a result of their enslavement in what would later become part of Canada. To start off, I'll give a brief background on Canadian slavery in general, and then narrow in on the nature of maritime slavery in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Next, I'll offer a comparative analysis between slavery in the Maritimes and other regions, particularly in the United States. And then after that, we'll be examining some transnational, transatlantic, or imperial connections that demonstrate how slavery in other parts of the Atlantic world shaped the nature and experiences of slavery and freedom in the Maritimes. I'll then close with a brief discussion on why this history of Canada matters. To most Americans and Canadians, the phrase Canadian slavery is an oxymoron. The majority of us were taught that slavery only happened in the United States, the southern United States specifically, and Canada fit in this story only as a place of freedom in the 1850s and 60s as the terminus to the Underground Railroad. This narrative is not necessarily false. Thousands of African and African-descended people did courageously take risks, challenge their state of bondage, and encounter degrees of freedom in British North America. But this narrative is incomplete. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, thousands of other Black people experienced a simultaneous journey from slavery in the American colonies to continued enslavement in the Maritimes. These people of African descent displayed equal courage and resilience to the free Black loyalists who successfully cast off their shackles in the wake of the American Revolution. Slavery touched all of North America in one form or another. I'll be focusing on the maritime region of Canada today, but it's important to remember that the widespread understanding of Black enslavement on plantations in the southern United States and Caribbean was just one kind of slavery out of many. Generalizations from those experiences may not apply in other cases, such as in the enslavement of Indigenous people, urban enslavement, or slavery in northern colonies, as we'll see. The fact that enslaved people traveled along the same routes as free Black loyalists complicates the notion that one of their destinations, the Canadian Maritimes, was a place of freedom. The re-enslavement of free Black loyalists there uproots that idea. The historical facts shatter the illusion that the region was a bastion against enslavement and the falsehood that they were far removed from slavery in the British Atlantic world. Slavery has a long and violent history in Canada. The earliest slaves were Indigenous, and documentation from New France reveals that these enslaved people were traded within and between Indigenous nations and French colonists. The first Black enslaved person documented in New France was Olivier Lejeune, who was born in Madagascar and arrived in Quebec in 1633. The historian Brett Rushforth argues that slavery in New France was shaped primarily by the alliances between France and its Indigenous allies. For the Maritime region, early records of slavery came from Ile Royale, which is present-day Cape Breton, during the early 1700s and 1760s, when it was part of the French Empire. When the British founded Halifax in 1749, hundreds of mostly enslaved, but some free Black people lived there. After the Acadian expulsion in the 1750s and 60s, the British invited people called New England planters to settle the region, and they too brought enslaved people. But the enslaved population in the Maritimes had its most marked growth with the Loyalist migration in the 1780s. During the American Revolution, colonists who wanted to break from the British Empire were called patriots or rebels, depending on what side you were on. Those who opposed revolution and remained loyal to the British Crown were called loyalists. After the American Revolution ended in 1783, British troops withdrew from the new United States. Loyalists relocated to Britain's remaining colonies in the Caribbean and in North America. The vast majority of them, roughly 30,000, migrated to the maritime colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Of these, 3,000, or 10%, were Black Loyalists. I'm going to start by giving an overview of who the Black Loyalists were before we discuss enslaved people. Black Loyalists were self-emancipated and free-born Black people who joined the British in the American Revolution for various reasons, but primarily in pursuit of freedom. Many joined after 1775, when Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, promised liberty to enslaved people who escaped their patriot enslavers and joined British lines. On the screen here is an image of that decree. A similar proclamation was issued by Sir Henry Clinton in 1779, which promised freedom and land. During the war, Black Loyalists performed diverse and essential labor as engineers, seamstresses, cooks, and soldiers. As the historian James Walker notes, British emancipatory offers were not altruistic or abolitionist. This sort of gesture wasn't rooted in the belief that slavery should be stopped, but rather it was a strategic military tactic to weaken patriots financially and socially by encouraging their human capital to escape. As thousands of enslaved people ran away to British lines, the patriot cause also suffered an ideological blow. Dunmore's recruits organized and formed the Ethiopian Regiment, and part of their uniform was a slogan that read, "Liberty to slaves." Black Loyalists included Harry Washington, who ran away from George Washington, as well as 30 people enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Founding fathers and other patriots were not the only enslavers, though. Britain did not offer freedom to those whom Loyalists enslaved. Indeed, white Loyalists entered the Maritimes as enslavers, even as they were refugees from war. They brought roughly 1,500 enslaved people to the region, and we'll unpack their stories in a moment. With the 1783 Treaty of Paris and the final evacuation of the British from New York, the American Revolutionary War came to an end. Refugees left the United States for Britain's remaining colonies, including East Florida, the Caribbean, and the Maritimes. The British commander Sir Guy Carleton oversaw the evacuation of the Loyalists. A spring fleet had left in April and a fall fleet left in October, carrying tens of thousands into the Maritimes, mainly to Shelburne, Nova Scotia. As Loyalists began their evacuations, however, the Treaty of Paris between Britain and the United States was not yet finalized. One of the preliminary articles would have required the British return Black Loyalists to their former patriot enslavers. Guy Carleton opposed these demands, but as a precaution in case they were finalized in the treaty, he oversaw that the names, ages, and descriptions of Black people leaving New York were recorded in the document shown here, which is called the Book of Negroes. Archival evidence of Black people in colonial North America generally lacks important personal information. This document is an incredibly important one for historians researching Black Loyalists and enslaved people in the Maritimes, because it tells us something about the lives of nearly 3,000 Black people, such as their places of birth, origins, and former enslavers, or the names of people who they came, quote, in the possession of. This ambiguous phrasing did not always mean explicit possession, although when it listed enslaved people and their enslavers, it did. But it did signify at least some sort of association with a white loyalist who could have acted as a sort of sponsor for free Black Loyalists, or to whom they were indentured to for their journey to Nova Scotia. For Black Loyalists, British officer General Samuel Birch issued what were called General Birch Certificates, or GBCs, pictured here. These certificates granted Black Loyalists, quote, permission to go to Nova Scotia or wherever else he may think proper. They were important because they indicated that the Black migrants were free. In Nova Scotia, many Black Loyalists settled in the community of Birchtown, named after the general, just outside of the predominantly white settlement of Shelburne. As you might imagine, and as we'll discuss, such certificates became very important in the Maritimes, where thousands of free Black Loyalists migrated to live out promises of freedom, yet lived alongside people who remained enslaved. A question I initially had, and that I often see come up with people learning this history for the first time, is how? How did people in what we now know as Canada allow enslavement to perpetuate on their northern soil? Was slavery clandestine, kept in shame as a secret? The short answer is no. Slavery was an unhidden feature of maritime society. Most white loyalists did not own other people, but every member of maritime society was familiar with slavery's practice and encountered reminders of it on a daily, on extraordinary basis. To be sure, maritime slavery was not the central organizing aspect of the maritime economy, although I do argue that slavery in other parts of the Atlantic shaped maritime lives and economy. The historian Ira Berlin differentiates between a slave society, which was socially and economically based on the institution of slavery, namely in places like the plantation South, and a society with slaves, which was not predominantly organized around an enslaved labor force, even though it did include enslaved people. And I think this latter formation is useful to bear in mind when considering maritime slavery. As we can see from this newspaper, the printing shops in the region produced materials that testify to the quotidian presence of slavery there, daily reminders. On this page, an advertisement from the St. John Gazette in New Brunswick notified readers of an enslaved person who ran away from his enslaver. It reads, quote, $16 reward and all reasonable charges will be paid to James Haight, or by James Haight, to any person who will detect and return Abraham, a runaway Negro boy about 16 years of age. He had on a short blue jacket with sleeves lined with white swanskin, a scarlet waistcoat, 2 rose bright buttons with a collar, nankeen breeches, thread stockings, new shoes, plated buckles, and an all-round black hat. He has a pleasant countenance, is very talkative, tall of his age, but well-proportioned, and formerly belonged to Captain John Hall of St. Andrews. James Haight, September 12, 1787. Now, compared to most advertisements, this one is particularly detailed, which tells us something about the significance of clothing, both for fugitives and for enslavers, but its presence in the newspaper would not have shocked readers. Fugitive slave advertisements like this point not only to one way that slavery was an everyday feature of maritime colonial culture, but the detail about Abraham's former enslaver also testifies to how enslaved people experienced sales and had to adapt to the demands of new enslavers. Furthermore, many enslavers in the Maritimes, such as merchants and farmers, had varying needs in their business operations and household demands. If they did not have a need for an enslaved person for a period of time, they sometimes hired their slaves out to other free people temporarily to extract greater profit from their human capital. This means that labor practices in the Maritimes permitted people with deeds to slaves and non-enslaving white people to profit from enslaved labor. This leads us to an important point. Rather than being far removed from white society, enslaved Black people worked, ate, and slept alongside their enslavers. Maritime slavery should therefore be understood as household slavery or close quarters slavery. I want to emphasize that this close relationship was not cooperative, it was coercive. The enslaver-enslaved dynamic in the Maritimes, therefore, was characterized and upheld by an intimate violence. The legal culture of the Maritimes permitted slavery, but also provided enslaved people with opportunities to challenge their bondage. In Prince Edward Island, a law concerning baptism of slaves gave legal recognition to slavery in the colony until it was repealed in 1825. But Nova Scotia and New Brunswick did not have statute laws protecting the institution of slavery, but it was practiced nonetheless and presumed lawful. While Black people faced violence, exploitation, and limited autonomy, the lack of positive slave law and the institution's increasing controversy within the British Empire encouraged some unfree Black people to challenge their bondage in court. Nova Scotia Chief Justices Thomas Strange and Sampson Salter Blowers handled cases as individual issues of emancipation rather than framing it within the larger issue of slavery's abolition. Other anti-slavery figures, such as Attorney General Richard John Uniacke, recognized the dangers in mentioning slavery in legislation and actually opposed bills that purportedly aimed at preventing free Black people from being unlawfully enslaved, precisely because those bills were proposed by slave owners, who in actuality sought to use them as a means of inserting slavery into statute law to make it legal. This social and legal culture shaped maritime slavery, but other elements also impacted daily life in the Maritimes. While parts of New Brunswick and PEI tended to be more hierarchical and agricultural, less commercial than Nova Scotia, coastal ports in all colonies facilitated Atlantic connections. Unable to match New England's productivity or profit from it due to post-war restrictions, maritime merchants were left to play middlemen for the more fruitful regions of the Atlantic world. They were also disadvantaged in some places with poor land for farming, so the Loyalists struggled to produce enough foodstuffs for their domestic market. Poorly situated to dominate the Atlantic economy, the Maritimes could not supply the West Indies as New England had done prior to the American Revolution. Still, trade to the Caribbean, mainly northern fish and lumber in exchange for tropical cane products such as sugar and rum, was among the most important aspects of the Loyalist maritime economy. As maritime slavery became increasingly challenged and less profitable due to the cheap labor of free Black Loyalists, enslavers found a ready market in the Caribbean to dispose of their slaves, and even kidnapped and re-enslaved Black Loyalists on vessels bound for those ports. Challenges with weather, setbacks to settle and cultivate the land, and poor political organization did not help economic and social struggles. The image you see here is of Shelburne in 1789. The town experienced rapid boom and bust development with the arrival of thousands of migrants. One engineer informed Guy Carleton, quote, "Timely provision not having been made by us cheating and laying out lands, in which great delays and irregularities have happened, and, quote, a sufficient number of surveyors not having been employed," end quote, he feared many of the refugees would perish. Through violence, British notions of property, and sheer numbers, the Loyalists dispossessed the Mi'kmaq of their land and altered the landscape through logging, fires, and the depletion of wildlife, forcing them to adapt their cultural and economic practices in order to survive. Disillusioned and weary white Loyalists bemoaned their dreary reality, what someone wrote in a ballad as, quote, "consigned to labor and be poor," while Black Loyalists were granted very little, if any, of the land promised to them, and when it was granted, it was of the poorest quality. This picture shows a replication of a Black Loyalist pit house at the Black Loyalist Heritage Site in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. For people who arrived with very little resources, constructing shelters like this one was essential for surviving harsh winters, especially for the fall fleet. The ground is dug out for a fire in the center and has an elevated edge around it to sit and sleep. As you can imagine, a new life in the Maritimes was not an easy one. Elites exploited the vulnerable position of Black Loyalists as formerly enslaved people and offered them low wages because they had no choice but to accept them. Poor white Loyalists became frustrated that they couldn't compete with their Black counterparts for jobs. This mounting anger coalesced and resulted in the Shelburne Race Riot in 1784, which drove Black Loyalists out of Shelburne and forced them to find refuge in the Black Loyalist settlement of Birchtown. Black Loyalists started churches. They were involved in local development as surveyors and engineers. They were entrepreneurs and sought to make the most of what land they were able to cultivate. Despite racism's prevalence in maritime society, there were also examples of interracial friendships and cooperation. For example, testimony from a 1785 court case in PEI reveals the occurrence of a party involving dinner, dancing, and drink with both white and Black invitees, including both enslaved and free Black Loyalists. I want to pause for a minute to think about the relationship between enslaved and free Black people in the Maritimes. We need to remember that these people neighbored one another. How do you think enslaved people felt living so close to such a large free Black community? What would that have been like for Black Loyalists who had recently escaped slavery in the United States? Although the legal differences between slavery and freedom were real, Black people in the Maritimes experienced racism and inequality regardless of their status. Enslaved people's experiences overlapped with those of nominally free Black Loyalists. They socialized, developed friendships, married one another, and had similar material conditions. For example, Black Loyalists might be indentured servants or tenants on white Loyalist farms, perform domestic labor for very low wages, or even live with white Loyalists. The image that you see here, a Black woodcutter at Shelburne, Nova Scotia, is the only contemporaneous picture of a Black Loyalist, which was done in 1788 by William Booth, who I'll mention was also an enslaver. Enslaved people and Black Loyalists alike performed manual labor like this, as well as skilled crafts such as barrel making. It's important to remember that all legal classes were subject to a social structure that privileged elite white men, and the line between freedom and slavery in the Maritimes was blurry. Often, slaves were referred euphemistically as servants, which can make it challenging to determine who was actually enslaved. Additionally, Black Loyalists were kidnapped or sold into slavery, or tricked into signing indentures that essentially made them bound for life. Because the presence of slavery threatened the security of Black Loyalists, it may be useful to think of them as not simply free, the Black Loyalists, but as unfree or nominally free. Still, enslaved people's challenges to their bondage in court reveals that the precarious legal status of slavery and the Black Loyalists' limited but meaningful opportunities for autonomy made the Maritimes a place where enslaved people could sometimes turn slavery and freedom's ambiguity to their advantage. Comparisons to other regimes of slavery allows us to better understand that enslaved people's experiences in the Maritimes were unique to different parts of the Atlantic world, but that it did have influences from and some similarities to elsewhere. Like the Maritimes, Northern slavery can be characterized as a society with slaves. Enslaved people in New England labored in an economy structured around the household, and they performed work along gendered lines. Enslaved people in New England could file suits in the courts. They had some legal rights, including owning property, but punishments tended to be harsher for Black people than white people who committed the same crimes. Due to, for example, Newport's major role in the slave trade, Rhode Island had the highest enslaved population in New England. In 1774, 14% of households there were slave owning. In the middle colonies, places that included New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, enslaved people labored on farms, at iron forges, as artisans and tradespeople, in domestic labor, and on the docks. By 1790, there were nearly 20,000 Black people in New York City. 17% of them were free. By contrast, the Black population in the Maritimes at its height in 1783 was about a fifth of that size, but 60% were free. Working on small farms domestically and at the ports, enslaved people in the Maritimes played a similar economic role as slaves in other northern colonies, but in both places, their experiences and social relations could vary greatly depending on the labor that they performed. The Chesapeake region was 39% Black in the 1780s. Compared to the southern colonies, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland had a significantly higher number of enslaved people who were born in the colonies rather than brought from Africa. This was because death rates declined and promoted the development of a more balanced sex ratio and more stable family formation. For enslaved people here, this sometimes created opportunities to have lasting relationships and a larger community. For enslaved people in rural parts of New Brunswick, for example, their lives were much more isolated, and it would have likely been more difficult to form friendships or find marriage partners. Tobacco in the Chesapeake was cultivated under close supervision, as shown here, and was carried out through gang labor, which was a brutal system that involved a continuous cycle of work, divided into single repetitive tasks performed lockstep, almost like an assembly line. Rice plantations in South Carolina and sugar plantations in the Caribbean required enormous amounts of labor with extremely high mortality rates due to disease, dangerous working conditions, and violence. As a result, enslaved people there were imported in great numbers from Africa, although this trend slowed in South Carolina in the years after the Stono Rebellion of 1739 due to white fears of insurrection. Rice was produced through the task system. Unlike the gang system, the task system allowed enslaved people to work at their own pace, provided that they complete their task by the end of the day. As a result, enslaved people in South Carolina could have extra time for themselves, sometimes to cultivate their own gardens and participate in an internal economy. As slave societies, the Southern and Caribbean colonies show us an economic organization that differed vastly from the Maritimes. But it's important to note that hundreds of loyalists moved from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And those who moved to Country Harbor, Nova Scotia, brought with them over 40 so-called servants. So some people had been enslaved in slave societies before and adapted to a different but no less violent society with slaves in the Maritimes. While the comparative study can help us identify regional differences, I believe one of the most powerful methodologies for studying enslaved and free Black loyalists is a transnational or transatlantic approach. Transnational here refers to movement between British North America and the United States, and transatlantic denotes movement across and along the Atlantic, including within the British Empire. Remember that an individual piece of archival evidence offers a glimpse of a very specific time and place and cannot stand on its own to represent other experiences. What one example shows us about one person's life may not be true for another's. By expanding our archival search to fill in the eventful transnational backgrounds and futures of people who are only briefly mentioned in the Maritime Provincial Archives, we can work around that fragmentary nature of maritime documentation about Black lives a little bit more. It allows us to do better justice telling these people's stories. Because individual lives were so often transnational or transatlantic, a biographical approach is an appropriate way to trace the depth of these regional connections. Simultaneously, a transnational and transatlantic approach to studying these individuals is valuable because such an approach prioritizes the chronology of enslaved people's lives as opposed to those of their white oppressors, who remain more visible in the archive. In Prince Edward Island, in the summer of 1784, an enslaved man named Mingo complained to his friend, a Black servant named James Stevens, that he had just been beaten by his enslaver and that, quote, if he could just get some associates, he would run away. Mingo proposed that they invite their enslaved friends, Ben and Peter. Both agreed, and the group settled on a plan to take the governor's boat, arm themselves with a musket, and sail to Boston. The scheme never ended up panning out, but it should make us stop to think about the potential that enslaved people of PEI saw in a voyage from Canadian slavery to American freedom. We can certainly use a transnational approach to better understand other migrations between the United States and Maritimes, but for the rest of this section, I'm going to focus on transatlantic connections to the Caribbean specifically, which is what I focus on in my research. The first case study we're going to be looking at concerns enslaved people going from the Maritimes to the Caribbean. The largest recorded sale of enslaved people between these regions occurred in 1784. John Wentworth, who had been the colonial governor of New Hampshire and later the lieutenant governor of Nova Scotia, sent 19 men, women, and children to his relative Paul in Suriname to settle a debt. In a letter, Wentworth described these individuals as, quote, perfectly stout, healthy, sober, orderly, industrious, and obedient. Some had been American-born, while others had been well-seasoned elsewhere. Seasoning refers to the forceful process of adjustment to enslavement that captured Africans underwent after crossing the Atlantic's Middle Passage. For example, one of the enslaved men, Quaco, probably had West African roots in present-day Ghana, where children were often named for the weekday they were born. Quaco is the Akan male day name for Wednesday. Quaco was also described as a field laborer, and he had an arm injured in an accident recently. Both of these facts tell us something about what labor these enslavers expected from their bondspeople, as well as the dangers encountered in that bondage. Wentworth considered the adults in terms of gender, production, reproduction. A woman named Venus apparently was, quote, useful in the hospital and tended to the garden. In Wentworth's eyes, another virtue of the women was that they, quote, promised well to increase their numbers. This suggests that he and Paul Wentworth valued female slaves for their reproductive capabilities. Potentially, these men sexually exploited them. Some enslavers encouraged forced coupling between their enslaved men and women, or raped women themselves. Documentation from the Maritime suggests this was not uncommon. As slaveholders, John and Paul Wentworth could have sexual access to these enslaved women. For his descriptions of the enslaved men, Wentworth emphasized how their strengths and abilities were well suited for the demanding plantation environment in Suriname. The enslaved men had been expert boatmen in Halifax and skilled in carpentry, sawing, and axing. Fated to arrive at one of Paul Wentworth's estates along Suriname's winding rivers and dense jungle, these men had skills that in all probability would have been transferable to Suriname, even though slavery looked very different there, with big estates, monocrop plantations with onerous cultivation requirements, and an oppressive tropical climate. A 1758 map from Suriname, pictured here, highlights Paul Wentworth's two estates. Both were probably sugar plantations, and they were over 30 miles apart. This map tells us that if members of the group were separated between these two plantations, they would have lived relatively far away from each other, and in that case, reunions would have been difficult, if not impossible. Separations, in fact, had already occurred, since John Wentworth kept two enslaved people named Matthew and Savannah at home in Nova Scotia. Furthermore, separation would have been an issue for the 4 children who were listed in the letter. The system of slavery that the children knew in Nova Scotia functioned with, quote, poultry yards, gardens, and carpentry occupying the maritime landscape of labor, spaces with which they were probably familiar and forced to labor in themselves. By contrast, even if they lived in Suriname on the same plantation as their parents or guardians, which wasn't guaranteed, family separation there was common for young children to experience during the day when mothers labored in the fields or domestically. In Suriname, youths generally began to work on plantations between the ages of 5 and 8, either in the fields, cooking sugar, or learning a craft. William may have tended livestock or served his owner as a page, while Celia, Venus, and Eleonora possibly were vulnerable to rape and pregnancy as soon as they turned 10 or 11 years old. The actual experiences of these 4 children in the Greater Caribbean are not known, but we do have a much better grasp on what they and the adults who traveled with them likely experienced in Suriname due to this map, which comes from outside the Maritime Archive. A final comment on this example. This map reveals a culture of resistance already in Suriname and allows us to think about the potential among this group to reject their bondage too. A Maroon village, a community of self-liberated, formerly enslaved people, appears in the densely forested region at the southern head of the Caudica River. If anyone successfully escaped Paul Wentworth's plantation, Sorghouben, they would not have been very far and may have joined this settlement. Unlike in the Maritimes, where enslaved people were often isolated and under their enslavers' close watch, the social structure of plantations sometimes created more physical distance between enslaved people and enslavers. The dense jungle geography may have facilitated marronage or other forms of resistance in ways that differed from what was possible in the Maritimes. Transatlantic migration occurred in the other direction too. So for our next few cases, we'll consider what it meant for some people to go from the Caribbean to the Maritimes. Typically, the origins of loyalist enslavers have been easier to trace than those whom they compelled to relocate with them. When we center enslaved people's stories and use a transatlantic lens, we can commence stories of Black people's migration to the Maritimes largely in terms of their Caribbean and African origins, which in many cases predated their loyalist and American backgrounds. Evidence of the impact of this northerly transatlantic migration can be seen through brief mention in documents like this runaway slave advertisement for Hector in 1784. When Hector ran away in New Brunswick, his enslaver Frederick William Hecht placed this advertisement in the Royal St. John Gazette and Nova Scotia Intelligencer to try to recover him. Hector had probably been born somewhere in the Caribbean or possibly Africa and grew up there, as Hecht noted his West Indian accent. This brief linguistic detail reveals that this man's connection to the West Indies produced a recognizable marker in his speech, despite also having lived in numerous other locales along the British Atlantic. As a vestige of their Caribbean backgrounds, enslaved people's language played a role in how others remembered, recorded, and related them to the West Indies. For example, like Hector, a woman named Betty Anna, who was enslaved in 1789 to William Booth, who was the artist of the drawings of the Shelburne and the woodcutter that I showed before. Betty Anna may have spoken with a marked Caribbean accent. Booth said that she and her fellow bondswoman used Creole vocabulary. It should not be overlooked that Booth described Betty Anna as, quote, clever, but somewhat inclined to be a tifi according to their own language. Tifi was a Creole term, likely meaning something like little girl, derived from the French petite fille. Booth's use of this term demonstrates he understood how the term was used among the 2 enslaved women by Creole speakers from the Caribbean and shows that enslaved people's words had impact and influence in maritime society. Primary sources show that enslaved people carried West Indian accents to the Maritimes, but they do not tell us other habits, preferences, or memories they brought with them during their voyages north. In the midst of enslaved people retaining identifying aspects of their Caribbean language and culture, interpersonal forces traveled with them as well. Relationships were created and changed with the forced migrations from the Caribbean to the Maritimes. Some enslaved people in the West Indies migrated to the Maritimes alongside slave owners with whom they lived and possibly had intimate relations. Betty Hume was one enslaved woman who lived in New Brunswick in 1787. A man named John Hume had purchased her in 1780 at Carriacou, one of the Grenadine Islands. She moved with him to Grenada for a time, gave birth in 1785 to a mixed-race son who was also enslaved to John and was likely his child. The birth of this child in Grenada brought the new responsibilities and supplemental work of motherhood upon Betty, in addition to whatever other labor she performed for Hume. Within 2 years of the birth of her son, she moved with her owner to New Brunswick. In May 1787, John emancipated the mother and child in St. John. It's unknown what happened to Betty and her son after their liberation. Whatever the particularities of their master-slave relations, it's clear that the decisions John Hume made, including moving to New Brunswick and emancipating Betty and her son, significantly impacted the lives of the enslaved mother and child. Experiencing New Brunswick first in bondage and then in some form of freedom, Betty doubtless drew upon the knowledge, skills, and memories she had acquired as an enslaved person in the West Indies. One enslaved couple, Kate and Manuel Jarvis, migrated to Nova Scotia as a result of their individual sales. A Dr. Bond in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, bought Manuel in December 1801 for 39 pounds from Colonel Louis Blanchard in the West Indies. By March of the next year, he purchased Kate from the same owner. Manuel and Kate were married shortly after her arrival to Nova Scotia. Sold just 3 months apart, we have to consider why Dr. Bond bought both Manuel and Kate specifically. Did Manuel petition his new enslaver to purchase someone he already considered a partner? Did Kate persuade Blanchard, her enslaver in the West Indies, to sell her to Dr. Bond so she could be with Manuel? The couple's relationship may have been strengthened or forged out of their common history in the West Indies, similar, albeit not simultaneous, voyages north, and shared ownership under Blanchard and Bond. The experiences and memories had a considerable effect upon both of their lives, and they may have been easier to bear in each other's company. What I hope you can see from these examples is that an emphasis on enslaved people's transatlantic backgrounds allows us to be more sensitive to the experiences they had under slavery in the Maritimes. I'd like to next discuss just some instances where Black loyalists were re-enslaved or threatened with re-enslavement to the Caribbean. This transatlantic connection was perhaps the most defining element of the maritime political economy, demonstrating the transgressions against Black freedom, the callousness towards Black families, and the influence of the Caribbean market. Take, for example, the story of Myrtilla Dixon, a free Black woman who was working as a domestic servant in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. She had relocated there with the family of New York loyalist Thomas Barclay. In 1791, after enduring sinister threats from Barclay's wife to, quote, ship her to the West Indies and there dispose of her as a slave, and, quote, being fully persuaded that she was to be put on board a vessel then ready for sea, Dixon fled the Barclays household to her father's home in the nearby Black loyalist settlement of Birchtown, which is pictured at the very top left side of the water at the top. Seeking further protection, she submitted a complaint to the court, anxiously petitioning for, quote, your honor's protection until Major Barclay can prove his claim. Threats to send Black servants to the West Indies as slaves conjured great fear among people whose legal status as free remained precarious. Dixon's distress of being disposed as a slave to the Caribbean exemplifies that there were sufficient connections between the Maritimes and West Indies to substantiate her fears. There are many other examples that suggest this as well. In 1794, the Shelburne grand jury received a complaint that, quote, a Negro boy formerly bound to John Stuart and by him transferred to some person in Liverpool has lately been carried off to the West Indies and left bound, as it is said, to some person there, end quote. The kidnapping and enslavement of this young boy probably meant the devastating separation from his family, and it would have upset the rest of the Black community in Shelburne and Birchtown. As the grand jury's complaint suggests, free Black people hesitated to send their children into indentured servitude because of how easily they suffered enslavement. The jury urged against the abduction of this child, less out of concerns for its illegality, which only received parenthetical mention, and more out of fear that, quote, a transaction of this nature, if overlooked, will be productive of much injury to the community in preventing the Negroes from finding out their children in the future, end quote. In other words, the Shelburne grand jury was more interested in maintaining the supply of cheap and exploitable Black labor than preventing the kidnapping and trafficking of people of African descent. Meanwhile, parents lived in a state of fear for the safety of their families, and they grieved the sudden losses of their children. The, quote, West Indies had a powerful discursive function in the Maritimes that both Black and white residents comprehended, deployed, and responded to in their conflicts over power and autonomy. Studying Canadian slavery in a comparative and transnational contexts changes our understanding of northeastern North America. It forces us to reckon with slavery's human impact in places that may seem far apart, or where human bondage took place at different scales. Through profits, sales, threats, and displacement, Caribbean slavery shaped the Atlantic Canadian economy and was a key component in the function of maritime slavery and in the insecurity of Black freedom. Towards the end of the 18th century, many Black loyalists recognized that the freedom that had been promised to them was unlikely to be fulfilled. Nearly 1,200 Black loyalists departed Halifax in 15 ships in pursuit of a different life. Their destination in these ships, pictured here, was Sierra Leone. Baptist preacher David George recounted in his memoir, quote, "The white people in Nova Scotia were very unwilling that we should go, though they had been very cruel to us and treated many of us as bad as though we had been slaves. They attempted to persuade us that if we went away, we should be slaves again," end quote. This history of slavery matters because enslaved people played an essential role in the history and development of the countries we live in today. Their actions, culture, and relationships shaped society, and their labor, knowledge, and stories transformed the places where they lived. When we are looking to locate Canadian slavery, perhaps we need to locate it beyond Canada, particularly because of the fluid connectivity in the Maritimes, the fluidity of status, the ease at which people migrated between there, New England, the American South, the Caribbean, Africa. We need to remember that archives are grounded in a particular place, but Black Canadian lives were often very mobile. They had lives that began or ended in the Caribbean. They lived in New York, or they moved back to the United States. When we encounter their stories, we have a more complete understanding of Canada and the United States' political, economic, and social histories, and we're able to recognize and better appreciate the impact of colonial North America's transatlantic orientation. Thank you.
Back on there, Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think we owe Sarah a round of applause. Thank you very much. Now for some questions. I have a microphone, so that means I can bring it to you. I'm looking to the class first before we go online. Any questions? Yes, sir. If you could state your name, what you're studying, and then your question.
Yeah, my name is Michael. I am a psychology major. And so his question is along the route of like international movement of Canadian slaves. So was it just focused mainly around the Maritimes, or was there evidence of from provinces now of Ontario or Quebec to other places in the world?
That's a great question, and I'm very glad you brought that up. Yes, slavery happened across what we now know as Canada. Montreal had a large enslaved population, as did Ontario. With this sort of slavery in the British Empire ended in the 1830s, and so it's a sort of earlier period than in the United States. But the largest sort of population that we see of enslaved people is, at least the largest kind of influx of enslaved people is the Maritimes. I'm forgetting the numbers as to how it relates to places in Quebec and Ontario, because my sense is that that's which would have had those sort of larger or comparable maybe enslaved populations, but definitely was predominant, at least regionally, in Nova Scotia. So that was a sort of significant population there. And I think that it's one of, if not the largest kind of place where people were enslaved in the Maritimes, at least, compared to other places.
Thank you so much. Any other questions here in the class? I saw a couple hands. Okay. State your name.
I am David. I am a master's student focusing on spiritualism. The Haitian Revolution had a repercussion on the slave societies of the Caribbean and the American South. Was there anything noticeable in change after the Haitian Revolution in Canada, or was that kind of a too far away, too small kind of issue for them?
Thank you for your question. I can't recall anything that I've learned that talks about that relationship between the Haitian Revolution and how and sort of its impact on slavery in the Maritimes. But by slavery did kind of die out by the early sort of 1800s. I think the last kind of record of an enslaved person there, I think, comes from I think it's 1828 in Prince Edward Island, which is even after it abolished slavery. But up until then, it became increasingly less profitable for people to enslave just because of the, the presence of Black loyalists. It was cheaper to hire them and not have to pay for their, living expenses and just pay them these really cheap wages. Rather than to own enslaved people. And plus, like the number of enslaved people who did kind of challenge their bondage or re-enslaved Black loyalists who kind of brought these issues to court made enslavers in the Maritime realize that it wasn't really a tenable thing for that long. So I'm not sure exactly the relationship to how that the impact of the Haitian Revolution, but time-wise, it might potentially kind of coincide that it was already declining in the Maritimes.
Any other questions here in the room?
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm studying anthropology, and so my question is kind of about reparations. It's not much of a thing in the US, but I'm wondering if you know if the Canadian government has taken any action towards reparations for the descendants of enslaved Canadians?
Thank you. I'm not sure if that's a federal kind of issue or something that's being seriously discussed in Canada. I haven't seen that. That's not to say that it isn't being discussed, but I do know that the sort of descendants of Black loyalists and sort of the African Nova Scotian community, for example, do maintain strong ties to this history. And so I think I'd have to look closely to see, to check on that answer. But I think that it wouldn't surprise me if this is coming up because the legacy is there and people's descendants are living in the Maritimes today.
Any more questions here in the classroom? Pretty good. Sarah, I'm going to move to one that has come in over Zoom, and it starts with the statement that I've wanted to take my children to historic sites. Where do you recommend that I go to highlight the impact of slavery in Canada?
Sorry, it was to visit historic sites, different historic sites?
Yes. Where would you recommend going that would highlight the impact of slavery in Canada to visit?
So I think that this is on my list, and I think that for relevant to this talk would be the first place I'd recommend. The Black Loyalist Heritage Site, which I mentioned, had that the pit house sort of replication kind of it. They have a Black Loyalist Heritage Center that is sort of a museum that describes this history in detail. And then they also have sort of a larger property that includes that pit house that I'm forgetting the other things on their property. I need to go myself. But I think that place has done a very strong kind of effort to make this history more aware in the public eye and also make it accessible for people to really engage with this history and learn it. And that's in Birchtown, which is just outside of Shelburne, Nova Scotia.
I have a question for you, actually, myself. I'm wondering if you've had any experience or if you could describe sort of any reactions or attitudes that you have seen Canadians have since you have started this research. Because as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, and that came about in the talk previous to yours in the speaker series, that Canadians don't like to admit that they have a history of racism towards Black people, and that they are very unfamiliar of the history of slavery. So what have been your encounters on this?
I mean, I think probably the most common reaction is surprise, or it's almost like people don't know what to say about it because they don't know that history. They don't know how to engage with it. And even people who I've sort of had conversations with about, my research, confuse it with the Underground Railroad, or like, I think that there's this common kind of misconception that this was slavery happening in the middle of the 19th century, but that looked really different from how it did in the kind of slightly earlier colonial period. And so I think that confusion with the Underground Railroad, because that plays such a huge role in kind of Canada's narrative about itself, I think that is what people latch onto when they hear slavery in Canada, and that's what they think. But then, oh, Canada had slaves, then that's sort of, it takes a little bit more unraveling. But on the whole, I think that the conversations I have had, people have been very interested, and also it's not like everyone's coming to this new. Like there is a greater recognition, I think, that Canada did have this history of slavery. I think it's maybe just not the details of it maybe aren't kind of ironed out for everyone, but people seem, I've been surprised, people seem very interested in kind of engaging in what that history was.
Let's hear from the class. Are we all good? Anything coming in? Well, then I'm going to ask my last one, which could be for the benefit of the students here. You are in, was it second year, PhD, third?
Second. Yeah, second.
What's it like being a PhD student right now? Where are you at in your program a little bit?
I'll be honest, this is not my favorite year of my academic studies. It's my second year. The first year I had courses, which was really great. And then this year is I'm preparing for a comprehensive exam. So reading lots and lots of books, and just knowing how this sort of big historical ideas speak to one another in the field. After that, though, I'll be able to start kind of my own research and writing for a dissertation. But for now, I'm reading lots of books.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to have the time for that. But that sounds wonderful, actually. We wish you all the best, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today. I'd like to thank our sponsors today for making today's talk possible, the help of the Alumni Association for their partnership. And there will be a recording made, there is a recording being made available to you shortly, and it'll also be posted to our website. And if we have any further questions for Sarah, just send them our way and we'll get them to her. Sarah, thank you so much. It's been lovely seeing you again. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.